Halloween night was always something in Maplewood. Every single house on the street was dolled up in gaudy lights and fake spider webs that stretched across porches with skeletons hanging from trees, each decoration a little more elaborate than the last. It was one night of the year where the quaint, sleepy town gets to pretend that it's something darker, a little more dangerous. But tonight felt different. It was one of those types of Halloweens where the thick autumn air seemed tense, almost stifling. That feeling of something not being quite right just wouldn't go away. I held a small get-together at my place, a tradition that had been kept alive since we'd all left high school many years ago. And so, Lily, Jackson, and Sam arrived with bags full of candy, beers in hand, and that same spark of nostalgia we carried with us every year. We were just in our late 20s, but Halloween had this way of reminding us what it felt like being young and reckless, to walk up and down dark streets and conjure our deepest fears right into reality. We sat in my kitchen talking about old times, our Halloween pranks, and teenage adventures, laughing about how Jackson had convinced the whole football team that the basement in our school was haunted. Remember that year we dared each other to knock on the abandoned house by the woods? Sam asked, grinning at me. I think it was you, Ethan, who ran off first. I laughed, but the memory seemed far colder than I'd anticipated. Hey, wasn't running off, I was checking for danger. Sure, Lily said, with a roll of her eyes. Brave Ethan, saving us from the horrors of peeling paint and creaky stairs. We laughed, but something in the back of my mind just wouldn't let go of that prickling sensation. Tonight wasn't quite right. The subject of discussion eventually led to strange rumors in town. Lily leaned in, lowering her voice to a whisper. So, any of you guys hear about the doorbell thing? What doorbell thing? Asked Jackson, an eyebrow raising. She glanced around, lowering her voice as if she feared someone would overhear us even out here. Some guy's been going door to door. Late. Not with kids or anything, just knocking. And when people answer, he asks, trick or threat? Like, not treat. Threat. We sat there for a quiet moment, the phrase hanging heavy in the air. Probably some idiot trying to prank everyone, Jackson said, though he didn't sound entirely convinced. Sam grinned, leaning back in her chair. Oh, come on. It's Halloween. There's always someone doing something weird. But I couldn't shake the feeling there was more to it. I'd heard a few things from my neighbors about strange happenings, how some people had answered the door and acted different after. I'd heard my fair share of small-town gossip, but now sitting here with my friends, the stories didn't seem quite so harmless. The clock struck 11 and the streets outside had started to quieten down. We could still see the glow of jack-o'-lanterns, flickering orange against the dark, and the occasional burst of laughter from some last-minute trick-or-treaters. I had just opened another beer when Sam sat up, squinting at the window. There's someone outside, she said, the tone light but curious. We all turned, and I felt my breath catch. A figure was standing at the end of my driveway, half hidden by shadows, dressed in dark clothing and wearing some kind of mask. I couldn't make out any details, he was just there, watching the house. Probably a kid, I muttered, though my voice shook. Or someone pulling a late Halloween prank. No way, Jackson said, standing up for a closer look. He's alone, and he's not moving. Just standing there. We watched another few seconds, frozen in place. Then, without warning whatsoever, the figure turned and walked toward the house across the street where the lights were still on. He stepped onto the porch, lifted his hand, and knocked 3 times. We could see the light from the porch casting long shadows over him, but still, his features remained hidden. A few moments passed before the door opened and we watched as our neighbor, Mr. Caldwell, a retired cop, answered. The figure leaned forward slightly and, though we couldn't hear what he was saying, I saw Mr. Caldwell's face go pale. Trick, or threat, Sam whispered, almost in disbelief. A chill ran down my spine as we kept watching. Caldwell nodded slowly before he closed the door, his hand lingering on the doorknob a beat too long. The figure turned and stepped back off the porch, again vanishing into the shadows. What the hell was that? Lily breathed low. I don't know, I said, not removing my gaze from Caldwell's house. He'd been a good friend to Mom and Dad through the years, a neighbor who was always there when someone needed a hand. Yet standing up on that porch, he seemed different. Like something had been taken from him, and all that was left was an empty shell. Maybe we should go check on him, Sam said, but Jackson was already shaking his head. Are you kidding? You saw how he looked. Whatever that guy said, it freaked him out. We fell silent again, each of us lost in our thoughts once more. I could feel the tension building, the unspoken question hanging between us. What if he comes here next? In a few minutes, Sam got to her feet and grasped her jacket. I don't know about you guys, but I am not going to sit here all night speculating as to what is going on. Let's go check it out. Check what out? I asked, though I should have known the answer. The door-to-door ringer, she said, her eyes shining with equal parts fear and excitement. If he's going door to door, he may still be out there. Let's see if we can find him. Are you nuts? Lily asked, though her tone was tinged with curiosity. Sam looked at each of us in turn challengingly. We all wanted to do something different tonight. Well, here's our chance. We can just walk around, see if we spot him again. If not, we come back and pretend this didn't happen. I sighed and looked around at the others. A part of me knew this was a bad idea, but that other part of me, the part that remembered Halloween dares and the thrill of a good scare, wouldn't leave the notion alone. Fine, I said, once I was on my feet. But we stay together, and if he starts coming our way, we get out of there. Deal? The rest nodded, and with that, we stepped out into the night, the cold autumn air catching our skin as we walked up the deserted street. The town was silent now, save for the rustling of leaves and the echo of our footsteps off the darkened houses. And thus began the search for the ringing doorbell. We walked down the street, the silence around us growing heavier with each step. The jack-o'-lanterns glowed eerily on porches, their flickering faces watching as we passed. Maplewood was quiet, but that feeling of something wrong persisted, creeping into the back of my mind and rooting itself there. She stuck close to Jackson, her arms wrapped tightly against the chill, as Sam forged ahead, her eyes scanning each shadow for any sign of the mysterious figure. We barely spoke, each of us had been lost in thoughts, trying to make sense of what we'd seen. Sam had been right, of course if we wanted answers, we were going to have to find them ourselves. I don't think this is such a good idea, Lily whispered, looking around nervously. What if he's dangerous? It's Halloween, Jackson replied, although I could tell he was as jittery as the rest of us. Probably some teenager in a costume trying to scare people. But I could make out the set of Sam's jaw, the gleam in her eye, and I knew there was more to it. She loved mysteries, and the opportunity to find one on Halloween night was too enticing to resist. I just wished some of that excitement had infected me. My own curiosity was tinged with something darker, the sense that whatever this doorbell ringer was, he was more than just a prank. We turned down the side street, past houses whose lights had already gone dark. The wind rustled through the leaves on the ground, the sound too loudly it seemed, through this quiet neighborhood. One house ahead, one light was still on, its faint illumination casting onto the lawn. I knew it was Mrs. Hendricks. She was an older lady and kept her lights on even well after trick-or-treaters had stopped knocking. That's when we saw him again. He was standing at the edge of her driveway, his face turned away from us. He still wore a long coat and mask, his frame was tall and thin, blurring unnaturally with the shadows. My pulse quickened, I gestured for all to stop. We went down behind a line of hedges and watched him. What's he doing? Jackson whispered. Waiting, Sam said, the figure holding her attention. Just like he did at Caldwell's house. As we watched, the figure moved, gliding silently across the lawn to Mrs. Hendrick's door. He lifted his hand and knocked, 3 measured taps that echoed faintly in the night. The light inside the house wavered, and a moment later, the door creaked open. We couldn't see Mrs. Hendricks clearly, but her frail silhouette appeared in the doorway. His voice was low as he bent forward, and only the words reached our ears. I strained to catch the whispered word, trick or threat. Mrs. Hendricks stared at him pale, frozen. She didn't say anything. She retreated a few backward steps, as if the sight of him had siphoned all energy from her. She trembled when she tried to shut the door, but an extended hand reached in and halted her. Trick, or threat, he repeated louder. A chill went down my spine as she murmured something we couldn't hear. He continued staring at her for some more seconds, after which he stepped backward to let her close the door. He turned, looking in our direction, as if he had felt our presence there. We held our breaths, not even uttering a word. And then, as if to freeze my heart, he raised a gloved hand and waved. Not a friendly wave, a slow, ominous gesture that felt like a warning. "We need to go," Lily whispered, no more than a breath. But Sam shook her head. "Wait. Let's see if he moves on to another house." I wanted to leave. Everything in me was screaming to get out of there, to stop playing this dangerous game. But something kept me rooted in place. Curiosity? Fear? I wasn't sure. Whatever it was, it held me there, eyes fixed on the figure. He walked back down the driveway, disappearing into darkness once again. We thought for one brief second that he was gone, but then we heard the faint sound of footsteps continuing farther on down the street to another house that still had its porch light on. "I don't think he's just going to stop," Jackson whispered. "What if he keeps going until... He didn't finish, but I knew what he meant. The figure had a purpose, something beyond a Halloween scare. And if we didn't find out what it was, there'd be more people like Mrs. Hendricks and Caldwell, left shaken and changed." I looked over at my friends. "We should split up, cover more ground," I suggested, though the idea made my stomach turn. Sam nodded, resolute. "Lily and Jackson, you two take the other side of the street. Ethan, you come with me. We'll meet back here in 10 minutes if we don't see anything." "All right," Jackson agreed, though he gave Lily's hand a reassuring squeeze. We split, the pairs disappearing silently onto our way. Sam and I crossed the street, going in the direction he'd gone, trying to stay as out of sight as possible. My heart pounded with every step amidst the silence that weighed on us. It was almost too quiet, like the whole town was holding its breath. We hadn't gone very far when we saw him again, now at the doorstep of a darkened house. I couldn't see who answered, but I could make out the same exchange, the same question. And again, the door closed slowly, almost reluctantly, as the figure turned back into the street. "Why do you think he's doing this?" I asked in a whisper, hoping that Sam had an answer, some theory that explained it all in a neat package. She shook her head. "I don't know, but whatever it is, it feels wrong. Like he's not just scaring people, but taking something from them." Before I could answer, the figure turned, catching sight of us. For a split second, his mask seemed to shift, the hollow eyes boring into us with an intensity that was dark. He took a step in our direction, and I felt Sam's grip on my arm tighten. "Run," she whispered, her voice urgent. With that, we hightailed it, running down the street as the silhouette of the figure behind us disappeared into the night. We stopped at the corner where we had agreed to meet the others, our breathing ragged, our hearts racing. We didn't have to say it out loud for everyone to know. Something dark was happening in Maplewood that went far beyond pulling a Halloween trick. We were leaning against the street lamp, catching our breath. It was several seconds later when Lily and Jackson joined us, looking every bit as ill at ease as we did. The street was still deserted, the houses still silent. It was as if the darkness itself was closing in, watching us. Did you see him? Jackson asked tensely. Sam nodded and I nodded. He has been at 2 other houses asking the same question, trick or threat? And each time, the person who responded looked altered. I stammered for my words. It's like he is sucking something out of them. Or planting something in them, Lily whispered, her skin pale. I don't know how to explain it, but there is something unnatural about him. Like he is feeding off their fear. There was silence between us, a place of digestion for both of us as to what we had seen. It was nonsensical, something that came right out of one of those ghost tales. Yet, we all had seen it, and we were not able to get rid of the sense of dread because it was tagged to us. What if he's not just picking random houses? Sam asked, breaking the silence. What if there's a reason he's going to certain people? You mean, like there's a pattern? Jackson said, frowning. Sam nodded slowly. Think about it. Caldwell, Mrs. Hendricks, they're both people who've lived here for decades. People with stories, people with secrets. Secrets? I asked, though I felt a pang of understanding. In a town like Maplewood, everyone had secrets, hidden beneath years of familiarity and routine. Everyone has something in their past they don't talk about, Sam said. And what if this guy, this doorbell ringer, knows that? Lily shivered, looking up and down the street. That's terrifying. How would he know? It was a question none of us had an answer to, and the silence made it that much more unnerving. He cleared his throat after a minute, eyes facing the floor. There's something I should probably tell you guys, he said, the beginning of the sentence stammered. You know my dad died a few years ago, but I never told any of you how he did. We exchanged a concerned glance. Jackson didn't make it a habit to discuss his dad much, except to say that he had died under very suspicious circumstances when he was all alone in their house on Halloween night. My dad. He wasn't exactly a great person. He had a lot of issues. Drinking, anger. I'd been trying to get him to change, but he always brushed me off. We'd had a huge fight that night. And when he died, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was somehow responsible. Lily set a hand on his shoulder, her eyes were soft with empathy. Jackson, you know it wasn't your fault. Perhaps, he said, looking away. But if this guy is after people with regrets, it makes sense, doesn't it? The weight of his words settled over us as, one by one, each of us considered the implication. If Jackson was right, and the doorbell ringer was targeting people with unresolved guilt or shame, then we might all be in danger. Sam turned to me, her eyes narrowing slightly. Ethan, didn't you have something like that too? That friend in high school, the one who... I shivered at the thought, but nodded, swallowing hard. Ryan. He was my best friend, until the night he got in that accident. I was supposed to meet him that night, but I bailed. He never made it home. I've always felt like it should have been me there, not him. Lily's hand went to her mouth as her face clouded with sorrow. I had no idea, Ethan. Yeah, well, it's not something I talk about, I muttered, turning away. But if this guy somehow knows about it, if he's here because of that, then none of us are safe. Lily was silent for a few moments, as if she were fighting her own war. Then, finally, she spoke, her voice no more than a whisper. In high school, I had a best friend, Rachel. We did literally everything together, and one night, we were able to sneak out, and I dared her to climb this old water tower. She slipped. I was the only one there, and she almost fell. She was fine, but I had never been more scared in my entire life. She moved away after that, and I never heard from her again. I always wondered if I pushed her too far. These confessions hung in the cold air, and for the first time I sensed, in light of this, something more than friendship. It was shared weight in regret, an invisible bond that tied us together and, perhaps, had drawn this malevolent figure into our lives. What does he want from us? Jackson finally asked, and his voice was dark. Is he here to punish us? To make us pay for something we can't change? I don't know, Sam replied in a whispered tone, but if he's targeting people with secrets, it's not a coincidence we're seeing him tonight. We just stood, the full gravity of our situation settling upon us. It wasn't just about fear, it was about something deeper inside each of us that had grown over the years. And now, somehow, it had called this creature to us. Then the faint sound of footsteps echoed the measured, deliberate sound of something approaching. We all froze and then turned toward the sound, but there was nothing on the street. Let's go, I said, the urgency spilling over into my voice. We can't stay out here. Not like this. Without waiting for an answer, I turned and took the front, the others following close behind. As we quickly made our way back toward my house, the feeling returned, our being watched, this time stronger than ever. It was as if the shadows themselves were shifting, moving closer, waiting for just that right moment to reach out and drag us down. Whatever this was, it wasn't anything that would be stopped. Not until it had made us face the ghosts we stopped at nothing to bury. The warmth inside my house felt alien, as if it no longer belonged to us. We had collected inside the living room and spoke in low tones, as if we were afraid he ringing our doorbell might hear us through the walls. Our walk back still seemed to reverberate in the air, from the regret of Jackson over his father, my guilt about Ryan, Lily's haunting memory of Rachel. It was as if voicing our secrets had summoned something wicked, their presence could no longer be denied. Sam leaned back onto the edge of the couch, her eyes narrowing down as she thought. If we're right, and he's targeting people with regrets, then why now? Why Halloween? There has to be more in it than just picking off random people with a guilty conscience. Jackson nodded, his hands rubbing together as if cold. Perhaps there's something about Halloween that attracts him? I mean, we all know there are superstitions about spirits and the dead coming back tonight. But what does he want from us in particular? Lily asked, her voice trembling. If he knows our secrets, why isn't he coming directly here? I flashed back to Caldwell's face, that hollow fear in his eyes as he'd stood in the doorway. Maybe, he's giving people a choice, I said as the disturbing thought formed. Trick or threat isn't just a question. It's a warning. Sam's eyes sharpened. You think he's making people choose between facing their own past or something worse? Maybe, I replied, the heat of the room aside. It's like he's offering a deal. You face your own demons, or he makes you. It sounded insane even as I spoke the words, and yet I could feel the words' truth, a truth that sent a shiver down my spine. So, what do we do? Jackson asked, looking around the room as if hoping one of us had the answer. Sam turned to each of us in turn. We have to confront him. Or, at least, see if there's a way to make him leave us alone. He can't be everywhere at once, right? I don't know about this, Lily muttered, wrapping her arms around herself. If we go looking for him, what if we don't come back the same way Caldwell and Mrs. Hendricks didn't? An uneasy silence ensued. We knew the risk, and we all felt that same insidious curiosity pulling. Ignoring him wouldn't halt whatever was happening, and if we did not confront it, the dread would haunt us for God knew how long. Then it settled, Sam said, her resolution slicing through our indecision. We'll go together. Confront him and demand some answers. As much as the idea terrified me, a part of me felt relief. The waiting, the helplessness, those were almost worse than the threat itself. I took a deep breath, steeling myself. All right. But if anything goes wrong, we're out. Agreed? Everyone nodded. We didn't have a plan beyond sticking together, but it was enough for now. We sat there, increasing our tension with each second that passed. The street outside quieted down and the last porch lights blinked out as the neighborhood at last settled down to sleep. Midnight approached, and with each tick of the clock, the air seemed to thicken. Just as we had about reached the point where we thought he was not coming, a faint knock echoed from the front door. Our heads whipped around in a mirror image of one another. Hearts racing, the only sound our treetop heavy breathing. The knock, steadfast, patient, like he knew we were inside, waiting on him. I drew a shaky breath and turned to the others. Ready? We all stood, making our way toward the door with as little noise as possible. I reached for the doorknob, trembling hand, and pulled it open. He was there. He was standing on the porch much as he had been, wearing the same dark coat, his face obscured by a plain mask that was featureless. This close, I could see how the mask was completely blank and that the hollow eyes gave nothing away. He tilted his head slightly, considering each of us in turn, as if silently appraising us. "Trick, or threat?" he asked, his voice was low and chillingly calm. I swallowed as my throat dried. "We want answers. Why are you here? Why are you doing this?" The figure was silent for a long time then, and I felt a creeping dread as he turned his gaze directly on me. Finally, he spoke. "You do know why," he said, rather matter-of-factly. "Each of you has something you've never said, a regret that's in the dark. Halloween night opens a door, an opportunity to make amends with those truths, or their consequences." "Consequences?" Jackson whispered, the color bleached from his face. The figure nodded, his mask fixed on us, immobile. "You each know what lies beneath your own guilt. I am merely the gatekeeper. Your choice is simple: confront the shadows you've cast, or carry them with you forever." Lily's voice shook as she stepped forward. "And if we don't? If we refuse to play your game?" The figure stirred for the first time, his head cocked to one side, the movement as close to a display of humor as this man displayed. "Refusal is not an option. To refuse the past is refusal of the self. And Halloween is a night for reckonings." After that, there was no other sound but the heavy silence. It was as if the words dove into each of our minds, tugging at memories and fears we tried to forget. I wanted to deny it, argue, but something inside told me he was right. My guilt about Ryan, Jackson's regret over his father, Lily's fear about her friend getting hurt, it all weighed on us, dragging us toward this moment. "What if we face it?" Sam asked. I would have expected her voice to break, but it was more steady than I thought it could be. The figure stepped backward, his eyes were dark, unreadable. "You'll know," he replied, a whisper in the wind. "Face your truths, or become shadows yourselves." With that, he turned, his figure melting into the darkness in a manner almost magical, as though he had never been there at all. We stood in silence, the door open to let in the chilly October air. We'd found him. We'd spoken to him. But the fear in my chest only mounted. This was far from over. We sat in silence after he disappeared, all of us trying to comprehend what had just happened. His words were in the air, they were like smoke clouding my mind. I could feel the weight of them, like some heavy shadow pressing down. "What do you think he meant, become shadows ourselves?" Lily asked in a quavering voice. Her eyes darted to each of us, her gaze searching for answers none of us had. "I think he means that if we don't face whatever we've buried, it will consume us," Sam said. "Our regrets, our secrets, they will haunt us. Maybe even destroy us." Jackson passed a hand through his hair, his face ashen. "So, what? We're supposed to just face all our darkest memories, and then he'll leave us alone? And if we don't, we're cursed?" "I don't know," I replied, my voice no more than a whisper. "But if what he says is true, then trying to avoid it might be worse." Again, the silence returned between us. Something each of us carried inside, a weight that had only increased with time. Hidden away from everyone else, and maybe even from ourselves. "We don't really have an option, do we?" Lily added, her voice so soft and yet so accepting of her almost imagined fate. Not if we want him to leave us alone, Sam replied, her tone grim. I turned to the clock. It was past midnight. And somehow, with the presence of the doorbell ringer gone, the room felt colder, like a chill we couldn't shake. Deep inside, I knew Sam was right, and the longer I sat thinking, the more I realized this was something I'd been running from for years. The accident with Ryan, the guilt I'd buried. I'd never really faced it. And now, it was time. Okay, I said, and a weird sense of calm washed over me. Let's do it. Tonight. Jackson looked at me, his eyes at once fearful and resolute. You mean we each go and face our past? Yes, I said, shocked by my own surety. We confront the thing that's haunted us the longest. Tonight. And maybe, just maybe, we'll finally be free of it. Nobody spoke against it. I think we all knew, deep inside, that this was inevitable. We parted ways, promising to reunite at my house once each of us had confronted our own ghosts. Sam was the first to leave, her determination as cold as steel as she put on her coat and left. I watched her walk down the driveway, her silhouette vanished into the night. We left one by one, each of us to a place where the memory of all touched us hardest. A strange cohesion among my friends and me was how we knew we were all facing something deeply personal, something shaping us. I walked to the park, a place that held a million nights when Ryan and I sat together, talking about our futures, our dreams. I hadn't been there since the accident, just the thought of that night had kept me away. But tonight, I needed to be there. The park was deserted, the swings creaking soft in the breeze. I walked the path, the soles of my feet sounding hollow against the quiet. Memories flooded back, the sound of Ryan's laughter, his voice, the way he'd always pushed me to go after things, never to back down. I had always admired him for that. And yet, the night of the accident, I'd let him down. I sat on one of the benches and looked toward the place where we usually meet. I'm sorry, I whispered. Caught in my throat, the words felt strangled. I should have been there. I shouldn't have bailed on you. The wind picked up, leaves rustling all around me, but a lightness settled into my chest. The words sounded freeing, like I was releasing something I'd clutched for far too long. Suddenly, I had the feeling of a presence beside me. I turned, half expecting to see the ringer of the doorbell, but there was nothing, just the park empty, silent, and still. Yet, somehow, I felt as though Ryan had heard me, as though he were here, forgiving me. I took a deep breath and got up. It felt like the weight in my chest was easing. I wasn't healed, but it was as though something in me was freed from that night. When I arrived at my house, Jackson was sitting on the porch steps, staring into the darkness. He looked up as I approached, and I could see in his eyes that he, too, was relieved, though his face did not change. I went to my dad's house, he said softly, even before I asked. Stood there for a while, just thinking about all the times we fought. About the last words I said to him. It wasn't easy, but I think I finally made peace with it. We both sat there and let the silence fall between us, both of us changed by the events of the night. Before long, Sam returned, her face fatigued but firm. I went to that water tower, she said to Lily, just then approaching. I stood at the bottom, where Rachel fell. All these years, I blamed myself for what happened to her. But tonight, it just felt different. Like I was finally letting her go. She gave her a little, encouraging nod, her own face soft with understanding. I went to her old house too, Lily added, placing her voice stable. I thought about how things ended between us, and how much guilt I'd held on to. I don't think it'll ever go away completely, but I think I'm ready to move forward. In that moment, as we sat together, it was as though the collective we had passed through a threshold, leaving some part of the past behind. Yet, as the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, it was then that I knew something chilling. He had not promised the doorbell ringer that facing our pasts would free us, only that it was necessary to confront them. I felt the old unease return, gnawing at me, as I realized our ordeal may not be over. And that's when the front door creaked open, and we turned to see him standing there, waiting. We were frozen in terror, barely daring to breathe, as he stood in the doorway, his dark coat merging him with the shadows, that featureless mask hiding any trace of humanity. His presence filled the room with a chilling coldness, as if the very air had frozen around us. "You came back," I finally said, my voice trembling. I wasn't sure whether my shaking hands were due to relief or fear. He cocked his head, that slow, unnatural movement sending a chill down my spine. "You have done well," he said, his voice seeming to come from everywhere and nowhere at all. But this was only the beginning. Jackson clenched his fists, his face hardening. "You told us we had to face our pasts. We did that. So why are you here? What more do you want?" The figure didn't say another word for a moment, and I could feel him appraising us, as if weighing what our worth might be. "Facing the past does not erase it. You have acknowledged your truths, but acceptance is not the same as absolution." "What does that even mean?" Sam asked, her voice much braver than any of the rest of us were feeling. The figure moved closer then, and for the first time, something seemed to be emanating from him, an energy, dark and unsettling, seeping into the room like smoke. "You have to understand, some things cannot be taken back, no matter how much you wish it so. You still carry those burdens, and until you can let them go, you are marked." "Marked?" Lily repeated, her voice just a whisper. The figure nodded. "You are connected to the things you regret, like chains binding you to shadows. Facing them was only the first step. You must now make a choice. Another option." I couldn't believe it. We had faced our deepest fears, our most painful memories, and yet he wanted more from us. But as much as I wanted to resist, I knew there was no turning back. We were too deep in this nightmare game. "What choice?" I asked, my voice firm even while my heart raced wildly. The figure before us turned to each of us in turn, and though his eyes were empty, somehow, they bored into each of us. "To truly release yourselves, one of you must make the ultimate sacrifice. Someone among you must bear the weight willingly of all freeing the others. Only then will you be unbound." And in that instant, the room fell silent, his words sinking in. It felt like the air had been sucked from the room. One of us had to take on everyone's guilt and pain to be the one who took all the shadows, so the others may walk away free. This can't be real," Lily said, her voice little above a whisper. "You're saying one of us has to, what, take on everyone's sins? How does that even work?" The figure didn't say another word. "It's a lie," Jackson spat, the expression of anger twisting on his face. "You're just trying to manipulate us. This is some sick joke, right? We did what you asked for, and now we're done here." But even as he spoke, I saw the doubt there, in his eyes. We were all thinking it, the truth hiding beneath the figure's words. Deep down, we knew this wasn't over. Sam looked around at each of us, her gaze lingering, searching. "I don't know if he's telling the truth. But, what if he is? What if one of us has to do this?" We were silent, lost to each other as we were to ourselves. It was a decision weighed heavy, and heavy it rested upon our shoulders. I felt the pull, the dark allure of releasing myself from this nightmare at the cost of one of us getting left behind. The very thought curdled in my stomach. "Look," I began, my voice trembling, "perhaps there is another way. Maybe we can share the weight, somehow." But he slowly shook his head. "There is no compromise. There is only the choice. To walk free, or to stay bound." She was crying now, the silent sobs running down her face. "I don't want anyone to suffer for my benefit," she said in a broken whisper. "Yet I cannot ask someone to take this for me." Sam leaned forward, taking her hand in his face contorted with an almost feral resolve. "We're not going to make that choice. If he wants one of us to suffer, he'll have to find another way. We're not abandoning each other. But the figure didn't move, like he had heard it all before. You have until dawn, he said, his voice an eerie echo. Then, you will either be freed, or bound forever. And then he was gone, leaving us to the thick silence that followed. The night inched a bit closer toward the morning, the clock ticking away while all we had was us and impossible choices. We sat in silence, the weight of the ultimatum hanging in the air, each of us lost to our own thoughts. Outside, the sky started to lighten very slightly, and with that came only the reminder that time was running out. My head searched for any alternative, some kind of way to get around the figure's game. Finally, it was Sam who spoke up, breaking the deadly silence. Her voice was barely above a whisper but firm with determination. I'll do it. We all turned to her in shock. No, Jackson replied promptly. You don't. None of us do. It's his game, and he is simply trying to trick us into some sort of thing we do not know we are doing. Sam shook her head. Her eyes were sad but resolved. You don't understand it. I've lived with my guilt longer than any of you. Rachel's fall, everything that happened afterwards, it haunts me. Maybe this is my chance to finally make it right. Sam, I said, fighting for words, you don't have to carry it all on your own. We're in it together. She smiled then, a bittersweet look crossing her face. I know. But, if it means you all get to walk away from this, then maybe it's worth it. No, Lily whispered, her face stricken. We're not losing you. But as we sat there, the reality of it settled over us. Someone had to take the weight or we'd all remain marked, bound to our regrets forever. And when the first light of dawn showed through the window, we realized a decision had to be taken. First slivers of dawn crept through the window, pale and gray. Sam's offer to take this burden upon himself hung in the air like smoke, each of us struggling in the midst of our relief and our despair. None of us wanted to be left behind, but losing Sam felt just as unbearable. Perhaps there's a way we can share it among ourselves, I suggested, desperation hoarsening my tone. If each of us can take a bit, perhaps that would be enough. Jackson nodded once, his face resolute. We're not leaving you to do this by yourself, Sam. It isn't right. Sam looked around at us, her eyes brimming with gratitude, but the terror and melancholy were still there. It was as if she knew something we didn't, that some kind of choice had already been made in those first moments when we saw him standing on the porch. I appreciate that, but I don't think it works that way, she said softly. He was clear only one of us can take it. No, Lily whispered, her hand clenching on Sam's. There has to be another way. But deep down, I knew Sam was right. The ringer of the doorbell had brought us here for a reason, and his rules, as twisted as they were, seemed unbreakable. About the only thing we still could control was who would bear the burden. I took a shaking breath, rising to my feet. If you're serious, Sam, then I just can't let you do this all by yourself. But I won't make that choice for you. If you really think you need to do this, we'll respect it. Jackson and Lily looked crestfallen, but they nodded, their faces were full of hurt comprehension. I could feel the weight of what was now expected of us, and I knew they did, too. Sam's face eased, and she leaned forward, pulling each of us into a hug. When she got to me, she squeezed a little tighter, as if she was committing the moment to memory. Thanks, she whispered in my ear. For everything. I pulled back, my throat tight. You're positive? She nodded, her face serene, though I knew the fear in her eyes was strobing bright. I am. The door creaked open just as the first rays of sun touched the horizon, and there he was again, the doorbell ringer standing in the entryway, his blank mask catching the light in an eerie glow. Sam stepped forward, her chin up, defiance in her eyes. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady. The figure regarded her, its posture unreadable. Then, he nodded once, a strangely respectful gesture, almost solemn. "You have chosen," he said, his voice carrying a finality that sent a shiver down my spine. "You shall bear the burden of all, and in so doing, free the others." Sam turned back to us, her face etched with a small, sad smile. "It's okay," she said, as if reassuring us. "I'll be fine." But we knew that wasn't true. We knew the words of the figure were laced with something sinister, something we couldn't quite fathom. With one final, deep breath, Sam turned to the figure. He extended a gloved hand, and as she took it, the air in the room grew thick as if a storm could break at any moment, its leading edge pressing in just beneath the surface. I watched in horror as some kind of shadow seemed to fall over her, dragging her toward the figure. Sam's body went rigid as her eyes widened, as if she could feel the weight upon her, crushing her. And in the next instant, they were gone. The door swung shut, and the room was silent, eerily so, as if the whole encounter had been no more than a dream. We glared dumbly at the empty space where they had stood, minds numbed by shock. Sam was gone, and with her, that presence which had haunted us all through the night. She's really gone," whispered Lily. Her voice caught, and tears fell freely down her face. Jackson pulled her close with his arms. I felt empty, as if I had been ripped apart. Sam had taken on our shadows, our regrets, and with that set us free. Still, it was too high a price to pay. We just stood there, staring at our grief, till morning light filled the room. The doorbell ringer was gone, but he'd taken a part of us with him. It became weeks, and the memory of that night continued to linger over us like a ghost. The townspeople went back to their normal lives, never knowing what evil had come and passed. For them, it was simply Halloween. For us, it was the night everything changed. We went to Sam's family, paid our respects, but what could we say that would explain how she vanished? How could we possibly tell them what really happened? That she'd sacrificed herself to some entity preying on regret and guilt? They'd think we were mad. But we knew. We each clutched a piece of that knowledge, and long after he who rang the doorbell was gone, the scar would never heal. And on every passing Halloween night, I went around half expecting to hear a knock on the door and then that haunted question. Trick, or threat? For all I knew, one day he would turn up again, and the burden would start all over. The succeeding days thereafter were very surreally perceived. The world had shifted, yet so profoundly and invisibly. Sam was gone, yet she was in everything, that one empty chair in our gatherings, the sound of her laughter ringing in our heads each time we thought about her. Life moved on, yet it was just as if a veil had fallen over everything. Of it, we did not speak that night she disappeared, not at first. It was too painful, too raw, it felt wrong even to try and put it into words. Yet each one of us carried the memory like a wound that wouldn't heal. To the townspeople, she had simply vanished, another soul into the inexplicable, and they mourned her absence, though distantly, without knowing the truth of her sacrifice. But we knew. We'd lived through the darkness of that night, had faced it as on a supplicant. And now we were left to make sense of what remained. We met again some weeks later in my house, but by that time neither of us could avoid any more the weight of that night. It was an unspoken understanding amongst us, it was the time to face what happened, and together at that. Lily poured the coffee in mugs, her hand shaking slightly as she put one in front of each one of us before she sat herself. Her eyes stared fixedly on the steaming cup in front of her. "You don't think that she's still out there? Somewhere?" The question hung in the air, heavy with sadness and doubt. I'd asked myself the same thing 100 times, playing back in my mind how she took the figure's hand and vanished. It was a possibility, and it haunted me, but I didn't have an answer. Jackson ran a hand over his face and leaned forward, his jaw clenched. "If she's out there, then maybe she's trapped. Maybe that thing is keeping her somewhere, feeding off her somehow." A chill ran down my spine as I remembered the words of the figure. To truly release ourselves, one of us must bear the weight of all. He had not lied, yet he had not really told us anything. I realized, now, that he had never really offered Sam freedom, just a place among the shadows. It's possible, I forced myself to say, looking each one of them in the eye. But there's nothing we can do. If he wanted her to be found, he wouldn't have taken her like that. He has her now. And I think she knew what she was doing when she made the choice. A tear fell, and Lily wiped it away, her lips pressed tightly together. It doesn't make it any easier. No, I said, my voice low. It doesn't. Sam's sacrifice had saved us, but the lack of her presence gave us a wound. More than a friend, she had been our strength, our bold spirit, guiding us into the night to face the nightmare head-on. It was as if when she went, part of us was taken, too. We sat in complete silence until finally Jackson spoke, barely above a whisper. What if he comes back next Halloween? What if he expects another choice? I felt the thought hit me with almost palpable force. Certainly, no one had considered that possibility. Halloween was but a year away, and already, the idea that the ringing of the doorbell might return sent my stomach twisting with dread. We cannot know that, I said hastily, my voice trembling slightly as I fought for composure. Maybe it is over now. He took what he came for. Lily's fear-filled eyes latched onto mine. But what if it is not, Ethan? What if we are still marked? I didn't have an answer, but my silence spoke louder than anything I might have said. We were safe, for the time being, but knowing that was little more than a shadow hanging over us, reminding every one of us, each in his own way, that such a calamity wasn't going to let go easily. The next Halloween was there, much quicker than any of us would have wanted. The weeks preceding it had been spent in quiet anticipation, each one of us in our private ways getting ready for the worst. The tension between us grew, shared fear is too much to bear. As night began to fall on Halloween, I found myself pacing my living room, stopping every few minutes to check the door as if waiting for a knock at any moment. I didn't have any plans to go out, none of us did. We'd decided to stay indoors, each of us alone, afraid that gathering together might summon him. The night passed, excruciatingly quiet. Every creak of the timber, every soft stirring of leaves outside, my heart jumped. Midnight passed, and then 1 o'clock in the morning, and then 2. I finally slept on the couch, jerking awake when the first light of dawn peered over the horizon. No knock came. No figure stood waiting at the door. Halloween was over and we were safe. For now. To this day, with years past, I think of Sam every October. Over time, Lily, Jackson, and I have drifted apart, held together by shared memories, torn asunder by the pain those memories carry. We speak occasionally, but we know that something was lost that night, something none of us will ever recover. The ringer of the doorbell never returned, but his shadow would still be hanging there, echoing the dark night. It was still this Hallows Eve that I was turning around to wait and wonder if someday he would ever come back for not a choice, but for the rest of us. And every Halloween night, just before midnight, I feel this strange presence, as if Sam's there, watching over me. I like to think she's found some peace, wherever she is. But I also wonder whether her sacrifice bound her to that dark realm, leaving her ghostly that watches over us, trapped forever in the shadows of Halloween night. Because some choices are never truly free.